The City of Southport Board of Aldermen and Planning Board Special Joint Workshop is now called to order. This is July 18th, 2022. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Planning Board, Board of Aldermen. Thank you. Our citizens, thank you for being here, city staff. I also want to welcome our consultants who are here tonight who plan to give their presentations, and then the Board of Aldermen and the Planning Board will ask questions, and we'll try to get as much information as we need to out. As you know, the Board of Aldermen meeting lasted 4 hours, so we're good, we're in shape and ready to go. So hopefully it won't take that long, though, to discern everything. I see you laughing, Madam Chairman. And I want to welcome Mr. Roger Perry from East West and Chad Paul from Ballhead Island Limited as well. Thank y'all for being here. Our invocation tonight will be from Reverend Alderman Lowe Davis. Please stand. This will be followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let us pray. Most merciful, loving God, we thank you for all the blessings you bestow on us individually and on this city. We ask now that you guide us in making good decisions for this city. Inspire us to have listening ears, clear eyes to see the path that will best serve the city. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Davis. The Board of Aldermen will approve the agenda, then the Planning Board will as well. So you have the agenda in front of you, and I will entertain a motion for approval.
Mr. Mayor, before we approve the agenda, I'd like to move that we consider allowing the public to ask questions of the consultants.
You know, that is a question you should have asked long before this. You've known about this meeting for a while. So that's something that you should have asked long before now, first of all. So we would have considered adding it to the agenda prior to it, is what I'm saying, instead of asking, right here. So as far as I'm concerned, it is fine for them to ask questions, but see, we normally do not have that at a workshop because it lengthens the workshop, because we will have a public hearing, and we'll also have a town hall right after the Planning Board makes their recommendations. So the public will have two times to ask questions and to comment.
It's just that it's been called to my attention, especially today, that people would like to be able to ask the consultants questions.
Sure.
As opposed to making comments, expressing opinions. These have been made public, and the reports are public, and there are questions that some of the public has.
Sure.
And I know what some of them are, and I hope that they'll be answered before we even get too far down in. But just in case, it'd be nice if people had the opportunity to directly ask questions of the consultants who won't be back with us.
Yeah, and I have no problem with that at all. Like I say, last meeting was 4 hours. I'm good. We can be here, and I understand the concern that the consultants would not be here, and some of our citizens would have questions that the Planning Board members and the Board of Aldermen may not have asked. So yes, that would be fine. That would be fine with me. So after the we will amend the agenda so that after the on item F, it says board comments. That should be board questions, and then item G will be public questions, not comments, but questions. And then item H will be adjourn. Thank you. So is there a motion to approve the agenda from the Board of Alderman's point of view? Okay. We have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem and by Alderman Lombardi. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? Okay, all right. Motion carried. Thank you. And I neglected to welcome WWAY, Sydney. Thank you for being here. All right, Madam Chairman.
Excuse me, if I might make an announcement. I know your microphones are shared, but if you could try to speak into them so that everybody could hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And what we will do, Mayor Pro Tem had and we don't have to amend the agenda for this, but what we will do is once the first presentation is made, then we'll go ahead and have the question and answer session, and then we'll do the second presentation and then have the question and answer session. So we'll stay on that topic. And we can also go back. I mean, it's not like you can't ask further questions of either consultant. So thank you. All right, item E. I will call on Thomas Lloyd to introduce our first speaker.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the Planning Board and Board of Aldermen. For our first presentation, we have Lucy Gallo, and she is from Development Planning and Financing Group. They are a nationwide fiscal analysis firm with offices around the country as well as in the Research Triangle where she is based out of. I will let her get on with the presentation.
Is that better? Yeah, there we go. Pleasure to be here this evening with you. Well, a little bit about the project team. I am a principal with Development Planning and Financing Group. We're a national real estate consulting firm. Also on the team was Dr. Emil Malizia. Dr. Malizia is the former professor and chair of city and regional planning at UNC Chapel Hill and frequently teams with our firms on engagements. The city asked us and engaged us to look at two different development scenarios. Under scenario one, which essentially would be the Indigo project, consists of 1,542 residential units, 70,000 square feet of commercial land uses, a 10,000 square foot amenity center, and under this development scenario assumes annexation into the city. Scenario two would be looking at the area that's in the ETJ under existing R20 zoning. which would accommodate about 550 single-family residential units, and there would be no annexation into the city under scenario 2. Fiscal impact methodologies. There are two primary methodologies. One is called marginal cost. The other is average cost or per capita. Under a marginal cost approach, it consists primarily of in-depth case study approach where there's in-depth interviews and analysis with the key service providers of the local government, considered a best practice approach, and obviously for a project of the size and scale of Indigo and the impact that it would have on the city of Southport, DPFG applied a marginal cost approach overall to the Indigo project. Some of the key fiscal assumptions, we looked primarily at the impact on the city's general fund. Enterprise funds such as water and sewer and electric funds are supported by fees and rates and not property taxes, and those are generally excluded from fiscal impact analysis. We prepared the analysis at the build-out of each of the scenarios as was dictated by our scope of work. We prepared the analysis in constant $2022 so that we didn't conflate any of the issues with trying to assume any sort of inflation. This is the most common technique used in fiscal analysis. It was prepared, as most fiscal analyses are, as a snapshot in time. We used the fiscal year 2023 property tax and fire fees. Those rates were held constant. In the analysis, fiscal year 2023 budget was used as the basis of the level for service. And as you all know, with the increases that were approved in the adopted fiscal 23 budget, there were enhanced level of service increases for the city. There were several calculations that DPFG applied to calculate the property tax base of Indigo. First of all, we had to revalue the 2022 market values to make sure that they were in sync with the revaluation cycle of Brunswick County. So those were restated to values as of January 1, 2019. And then we also applied a couple of other indexes to further reduce those values to make them as our best estimate of what the Brunswick County property assessor would value the properties. Obviously, the largest revenue line item in the city of Southport is property taxes. So the property tax projection for Indigo at build-out is about $2.3 million. The project will also generate personal and motor vehicle property taxes, local option sales tax revenue, and then some other state shared revenues. On the expenditure side, as I mentioned, we applied a case study approach where we worked very closely with the key service providers of the city. I think it was a really helpful process. We applied over 70% of the budget. The city's budget was examined using the case study approach, a very collaborative process. The leadership of the city has been very engaged. It was a real pleasure to work with. They know what they're doing. They know how to plan ahead. Part of what our approach, the result is a real transparency of the fiscal modeling results. And hopefully it's been an informative and an effective planning process. An overview of what was determined that the needs would be from Indigo would be a new crew of firefighters, a new crew of 3 advanced DMTs, 6 new police officers, 2 new staff accountants, a new administrative assistant, street maintenance, ongoing life cycle cost estimates were prepared by Withers and Ravenel, so those were incorporated into the study. For animal protective services and parks and recreation, those departments were, the impact was calculated to continue the existing levels of service. In working with department heads as part of our process, we also do other types of analysis and looking at the cost from a different lens in terms of existing levels of service, enhanced levels of service, trying to see if we've missed anything and looking at it again through all lenses. So this is just a comparison of the level of service for both the fire and police department. That Indigo, well, the service compared to the city's level of service today. Just one of the many techniques that we used in evaluating the appropriateness of the estimates. We determined during the course of the engagement that because of the location of the project, there are no additional fire EMS facilities, vehicles, or equipment. Personnel only were the needs of the Southport Fire District. The City Hall is currently nearing capacity, so we built into the fiscal model additional office space and evidence storage space for the police department, and additional office space for the finance department. Capital needs for the police would obviously be new vehicles for the new police officers. And as I mentioned earlier, the annual cost of street maintenance was provided by Withers and Ravenel. A little bit more explanation on the Southport Fire District. This is kind of the technical details about the ability of the fire department to be able to serve the Indigo project for all components without incurring additional equipment. And then just from another lens, UNC annually publishes a benchmarking report. So you can just take at a glimpse, some of these communities participated in the benchmarking. It's not that they were selected because they were apples and apples, the profile of Southport, but just give you a sense of answering again the question of is there sufficient equipment to meet the needs of the Indigo project, and as Chief Drew opined, and we agree, there appears to be adequate equipment to serve the Indigo project. A summary of the annual expenditures. Again, as you would expect, the bulk of the costs are in the police and fire departments, consistent with the budget needs of the city today. And at build-out fiscal, the net fiscal benefit of the project is expected to be about $1.4 million for the city, and it is assumed that those costs will help offset some of the city's fixed capital and operating expenditures, or if there was the need to and the desire to enhance some levels of service in areas, for example, like parks and recreation, that some additional dollars would be available to serve those needs. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry about this. Under scenario 2, if you'll remember, those are the 550 residential units in the ETJ, which would not be annexed into the city. And the fire fees are calculated in this slide, as well as the cost that these 550 homes would trigger for the Southport Fire District. So in a couple of things, so as you can tell, so under scenario 2, there would be a negative fiscal benefit of simply allowing the 550 homes to be developed in the Southport Fire District. The activity in the ETJ affects the city because at times the city has to subsidize the the cost of the Southport Fire District. The service population in the district is 13,000, even though the population of the city is only 4,000. And there are constraints with the limits of fire fees that are limited by state statute, as well as the amount of EMS fees that can be charged. So in comparison, this would be very much a less attractive option for the city. Not to mention that even though this would be a direct subsidy by the city, having growth in the ETJ affects your police and parks and recreation department too, because that would increase visitors into the city without generating any property tax revenue for the city. I think that was my last slide. So, and I think the Withers and Ravenel folks may continue on because they kind of pick up where we left off and maybe do questions all at the same time, if that's okay.
That's what we should do, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I appreciate that. That's all right.
All right, thank you. Hello, I'm Eddie Staley, Chief Client Experience and Innovation Officer with Withers Ravenel. We're a civil engineering firm located throughout the Carolinas. With me tonight is Shannon Moore. Shannon is the Director of Financial Services for our firm. These are a few of the other team members that participated on this project. Brandon Inscore had planned on being here tonight, but he is performing his civic duty by serving on a jury. So I'm filling in for him tonight. So a couple of things to go over the project objectives. We actually spent quite a bit of time with the developer, understanding what their plans were for the project, how that project schedule would be built out over time. Much like Lucy, we spent a lot of time with staff as well. And I will concur with her comments. Very knowledgeable staff, very helpful staff throughout this entire project. We did take a look at the most influential revenues and expenditures that would be affected by this development. And again, we built off of some of the numbers that Lucy had prepared before as well. And we did some other analysis as well and took it a point of view a bit more from an engineering standpoint. So I think Lucy mentioned earlier some of the calculated life cycle cost for maintaining the new pavement or the new streets that would be part of this development. We also did a 10-year financial analysis to really kind of look at cash flow of how this development would basically pay for itself or not pay for itself over time. What would those expenditures look like compared to those revenues being gathered? So again, very similar process, just from a little bit different methodology, a bit more engineering based. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to kind of dive into some of the numbers.
Thanks, Eddie. So as Eddie mentioned, we took a little bit of a different approach. We did build some inflationary cost into our 10-year modeling. And just to go over some assumptions that we have made on the revenue side, in terms of ad valorem property taxes, we used those figures based on the FY23 tax rate, which is 39.56 cents per 100 valuation. And we did not increase that in the base analysis. We had the property values equivalent to the market values that were provided by the developer. We used a collection rate of 98%. That's fairly conservative. I think the last audit numbers found on the website somewhere around 99%, so that's a little bit tampered down. And we did not build any property revaluation into our 10-year analysis. And we have the revenue growth lagging 1 year after the actual build out. So you start to see that after the project is fully developed each year. And other other major revenue sources, the four that we found in the current budget were your sales tax, ABC revenues, utility franchise, and your fire district fees. We did those based on a current per capita basis, which comes out to about $997 per resident in the same year of the actual CO build. And then we have annually adjusted your revenues at a 1% growth factor each year. The assumptions we made on the expense side, we did use the additional expense base that was provided by DPFG's detailed analysis based on surveys with city staff. And we used those FY23 values in the general fund. That's just under $1.8 million in additional expenses. That does include a $200,000 annual cost for the pavement maintenance, as Eddie mentioned. The fire side is $260,000 increase in your expenses, and the EMS is $265,000. And we built out the annual percentage of expenses at the same cumulative rate based on the build out, 1 year after the project build, so that way you're not incurring the expenses until you actually start to see that revenue growth from the project. And we have annually adjusted your expenses at a 4% growth factor. Today, that's a fairly conservative number, but on an annual basis over time, that's generally where we see in the urban South. And then on the base analysis, based on those assumptions with no other changes, your 10-year cumulative revenue surplus is around $15.5 million. And you'll start to see it kind of level off as the project starts a majority of the build around years 6 and 7 to about $2 to $2.5 million surplus per year. And then we made some tweaks. The first tweak we made using that base analysis, if, for example, your expenditures were underestimated, there are some things maybe that you haven't anticipated, we wanted to kind of look at the sensitivity of how much your expense load can take in this model. And you'll start to see in this first analysis, if your expenses exceed your current projections, that $2.4 million that we received from staff, by 70%, which is a pretty large growth factor in your expenses, by year 10, you're still pretty much at a break even with this project. And you will notice kind of those last couple of years, it starts to tamper down pretty far on the surplus. We've kind of got a little bit of a bell curve here where it peaks in year 5 at $1.5 million, and then by year 10, you're pretty much flat. Obviously, in this scenario, you would kind of have to take a look at, if this were a real scenario, kind of where your expense load and revenue load is in those latter years and possibly make some adjustments. But again, there's a pretty large factor in terms of how large your expenses can be over the forecast. This kind of second scenario we looked at were, what if your property tax values are actually overestimated in that base model? And so if you take the property taxes that were provided by the developer at that market rate, and those were actually reduced by 25%, you've still got a pretty profitable scenario. 10-year cumulative revenue surplus under this scenario would be $11.6 million. And again, you kind of taper off in those last couple of years at a peak of kind of 1.7 to 1.8 million surplus per year. And then the third scenario we looked at, again, all these scenarios are independent of each other. It's just making one minor adjustment over that base. The last scenario we looked at was if you had a 1 cent tax increase on your ad valorem annually, based on those assumptions we made in the previous slides, you would still have a pretty large revenue surplus on this project of $18 million over 10 years. And so what did we find in our analysis? We found that the developer's schedule definitely affects the outcomes. So if this project build were to be faster or slower, obviously a lot of those revenues and expenditures would need to be adjusted in that base model. And the analysis is based on the current FY23 fiscal year data, and projections are made for all of those future years in years 2 through 10. And then, of course, as we've seen in the past, your revenues can decline due to a lot of risk factors. For example, COVID-19, operating costs go well beyond your projections in that first scenario. And if you have persistently high inflation or an economic downturn, those can affect the results of these analyses. And then also we found that the ad valorem tax changes has a very small impact over your operating costs or your developer property values. That's where you really start to see a lot of changes in the analysis is based on those revenues being over what you plan or the revenues being under your plan. And then of course your location will greatly affect your operating cost and your financial feasibility of this project. Again, this project is located near a fire station, so you have very minimal fire needs. You have no water and sewer needs by the city, and you have no stormwater needs based on interviews with city staff. And so here, I'll kind of turn it back over to Eddie to kind of wrap up with a conclusion.
Thanks a lot. So in summary, one of the models that Shannon showed was that sensitivity model that, again, we're making assumptions about the future. And ultimately, even with a 70% difference between the assumptions made, that's a pretty large room for error, it's still a cash flow positive development for the community. That makes it a very low financial risk. Again, if it develops at a slower pace, again, the revenues will be delayed, but the expenditures will be delayed. And so again, we're never seeing anywhere inside the financial model where ultimately the expenditures are exceeding the revenues that would be generated from the tax base. This development picked up and put into a different location would have very, very different results. And that's something that we're actually working with city staff on now, of looking at other areas in the community for this type of future project. If it does come, where are those areas that are going to be very impactful to the services that the city provides? And again, so the fact that water and sewer are going to be provided by the county, not by the city, is a major burden taken off of the city and a major expenditure that will be taken off the city. Also, we did put in the model an average annualized investment of $200,000 in maintaining the pavement. And that would not happen immediately in the first years. Obviously, you would have brand new streets in the area. But over time, you're going to need to make some pretty major investments in those streets because they are wider, curb and gutter, sidewalks. That level of service that's being provided in that neighborhood is a little bit greater than many of the other streets. And so just understanding what those long-term investments are going to need to be. Again, those numbers are already factored into this scenario as well. So no surprises there. The stormwater side, right now, again, because of location, the stormwater is being handled pretty much on site. There's still some details there from the development plans to be worked out. But overall, it is basically being treated on site and not being transported through the community. So my kind of last closing statement here, again, we looked at this development from a financial standpoint. We're not here to speak about, does it fit to the community? Does it, is it a good thing or a bad thing for this community? That's not why we're here. We're here simply to understand the financial impact, and does the development itself actually sustain the investments. So with that, I will close out, and I guess we will take questions.
Thank you. Those were excellent presentations by both groups. And one of the things many things, the one comment that I have is that, for example, our police department, we already need a separate freestanding, police department building, and that's one of the things I've talked to Chief Coring about this, and that's one of the things we need to do regardless if Indigo comes or not. I think it is time for that, and this will keep City Hall from being overwhelmed. We have a beautiful fire department. I think our police department deserves that similar treatment. So I just want the citizens to know that that's where we're moving in that regard, and that Indigo is not a factor in that. What I would like to do now is I will start with Mayor Pro Tem, and if she would like to start with questions. I know she usually goes last because she's at the other end, but she's to my right today. So, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. I'm not as organized as I'd like to be because it's an interesting, different type of material. In your calculations, can you put back up the trending for you? The cumulatives, yeah.
And that is the base model. So this is the model.
Right.
This is the
One of my,
model.
thank you. One of my questions, in just doing some of my research trying to prepare for tonight, studies I saw were greater than 10 years in a cumulative, like to see what 20-year trajectory would be. And so for me, I think, so is the first year the beginning of it, and then year 10 is the build out? What's the relationship of those years?
So year one is essentially with no impact of the development, so that's kind of your base of FY23. So year 10 would be 33, and I believe the build out is complete in year 8.
Okay.
It's like the developer's proposed build out is basically about a 7-year build out, which would occur 8 in the model with a 1-year lag.
Because my question is the trajectory going to continue to go down? Because I know, and also, are y'all versed in the effects of annexation and all that? Can I ask those kinds of questions about, long-term effects of annexation and that conversation?
We're versed there. I'm not sure about your specific question. We'll be more than glad to entertain it and answer as best we can.
Well, and there's certainly a school of thought that annexation long-term, I believe one of the things talks about it being like a sugar high, and I'm sure y'all familiar with strong towns and all that language. And so I guess my question is, are there circumstances that make development when you annex it in better, not specific to this project necessarily, but as a practice, or that might be those markers?
I'll take. So ultimately, and let me commend you on this again. Many of these the analysis here, a lot of it is driven by the decisions that this board makes. What is your current tax rate? Mm-hmm. What are your water and sewer rates? Again, are the revenues that are being generated by those rates able to support the level of service requirements for each one of those services that you provide? And so again, the ad valorem tax rate adjustment you made, that made a fairly large impact on the outcomes of this. These numbers would be very different without that increase. Generally speaking, annexing in and gathering the ad valorem tax, that is your biggest revenue source. So again, I think from Lucy's model, I think you kind of showed one of those as being a lower density, right? And again, the revenue generation from that greatly reduced. So over time, you really should not see it drop off unless the fees and the taxes and the rates that you charge are not properly sized for the level of service that you're providing. Does that make sense?
So are you saying then year 10 is sort of a plateau number given all things being equal?
You want to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly have extended this out multiple years, 15, 20 years, but I would say this is probably kind of your plateau. Again, it's, there's a lot of factors that are unknown once you start looking at, 10 years out in terms of, revaluation values, your tax rate in that year 10 could be very different. And, again, our assumptions did not build any kind of revaluation into this model. It just kept those values based on the developer market rate.
Could one extrapolate that these are based on, I'm just going to use round numbers, 1,500 homes? I'm just going to use that as a round number. Could we extrapolate that if you cut that in half, then this would be cut in half? Or are there other mitigating circumstances?
So there would definitely be some other circumstances based on, what your actual expense load would need to look like. If this property were half the size it is today, it would greatly change the expenses you probably need to support this.
I think I'll take a pass now and let y'all, and then I'll circle back.
Alderman Lombardi.
Has 1,542 homes been identified and placed? I haven't seen anything. I don't know if the planning board has, but has 1,542 homes been actually placed on this property?
I think that may be a good question for the planning board, but the plan set that was prepared and given to us, again, those are 1,542 dwelling units, so that could be condominiums, apartments. It's not necessarily single-family homes. And there is a proposed layout for that development that was provided to us. How far along that is in the planning process and acceptance and approval, I'm not aware of that. I don't know if someone from the planning board would want to speak to that, or from planning.
That's just the proposed density. Now, they have not done detailed engineering plans actually laying that out to see, how that fits on there. But that is a proposed density.
But can actual 1,542 homes be placed on that property?
I mean, there has not been detailed engineering on that yet, so I cannot answer that question.
Okay, that's it.
This actually is a question for the city manager first. Are we obligated to take the roads and expend the 200,000? Part of the road, a part of the property is in the city limits, part of it's in the ETJ. Thomas, sorry, I guess that's for you.
I thought you said the city manager, sorry. So your question is, are we obligated to maintain those roads?
If we did not accept the roads that are in the ETJ, if they don't annex, we don't have to accept them and we don't have to maintain them, correct?
Yes, so to be clear, if it's in the ETJ, we can't maintain those roads because it's in the ETJ and it wouldn't be in the corporate limits. It has to be in the corporate limits for us to maintain those.
So the underlying issue and assumption is that this whole tract becomes part of the city limits, that it annexes, right?
Yes.
Oh, I guess they're the ones I should ask that. You assume that this has all been annexed in your analysis?
That's correct.
Okay, Alderman Alt.
You made comment that since the city is not involved in the city and water, that's a great benefit to us. Did you take into effect that we are not getting the, I want to make sure I say this right, the system development fees of $18,000 a house, which comes out to about $29 to $30 million that we're not going to get? Is that the great benefit? Because right now, this is one pipe.
Yeah.
A $2 million pipe to go to a lift station?
Yeah, so I think there's opportunity for further analysis there, but looking at the information available to us in this, there's a lot of age to the system that would be affected. There's some capacity issues that would need to be addressed. Again, that can take a little bit, a good bit more analysis to go through.
My understanding is there's one pipe. If I understood Mr. Paul correctly, up, and I believe, and please, sir, correct me if I'm wrong on this. And there's going to be there's going to be the development, and they have their pipes. And there's a pipe that comes out to Robert Rourke, and it hangs a right, and it goes under the 133, 87 to 11, and it goes up to Jabbertown Road, where there's a lift station, and that cost was estimated at $2 million. So it's a single pipe versus $30 million. I'm just trying to figure out the math. Because I originally was the same place you were. I thought they were going to connect into our ancient pipes that couldn't sustain it. But there's a fix. It's a single pipe.
Again, there was not a deep analysis prepared there because we were directed that it was going to the county, that's where it was going. But based on some of the initial analysis that we did go through, I think the impacts may be greater than just that one pump station.
I don't know. That was
Capacity.
the only number that was thrown out.
I was just going to concur with Alderman Mosteller there that the biggest issue would be capacity, and we would have to get additional capacity from the county on top of what we're already expanding right now at the plant.
Okay.
In this regard, again, just so the citizens know as well, that we have moved towards regionalization with the county. In fact, at our meeting last week, you saw where we received approval for this $29 million revolving loan, and that is to help pay for the expansion of the Brunswick wastewater treatment plant in the Charlotte area. So we're moving towards regionalization, which I think in the long run it will benefit the city. And as you know, we reversed a previous board where they were going to build their own wastewater treatment plant. So we're moving past that, and I think that's the correct direction to go. And then one day the county will, once we get our sewer system up, they will take over the entire sewer system for the city, and I think that will be a benefit as well.
Well, am I incorrect to say that we're studying that possibility and that has not been voted on? And the fact, so whether we go, I'm not talking about building a sewer plant, okay? Right now, we don't have a sewer plant, but we charge fees to hook up to your house. And we would have to pay, I grant you, we would have to pay probably some more money for excess capacity. I understand that, but I don't know what that number is, and I was curious if you guys had looked at that, but you have not. So my next question is going to be, at one point, not your slide, but ma'am, your slide, as I understand it, you thought it was going to be like a $1.3, $1.4 million surplus average over 10 years. Is that correct?
At build-out, stabilized at build-out, annual.
Correct.
Uh-huh.
And in your booklet, you talk about the need to build out 10,000 square feet of office space at City Hall, and then in another page you talk about 2,000 square feet for the police department, and I was unsure if that's 12,000 feet or the 2,000 was part of the 10,000.
Good question. So in the expenditure model, we have included an additional 2,000 square feet for police needs, excuse me, and 1,500 square feet related to the additional finance positions. So the 10,000 square feet you mentioned, that's the project's amenity center. So completely different than the square footage requirements of the city.
Okay, so whatever that square footage is, on page 21, when you're doing here comes the income and here goes the outflow.
Right.
is there a line item that I'm missing that says what that cost would be?
It's the cost, and we used a interest finance mortgage payment, if you will, for the cost associated with the 2,000 square feet and the 1,500 square feet, and it would be within the police section and the finance section. I can look up the tables for you real quick.
So of the police's $812,000, you've included in that the building costs?
Correct.
Okay. I just didn't see that delineated on this form.
Yeah, if you want to look on page 15 of the report, table 21, under the new facility, that outlines the cost associated with the new police square
Yeah, I
square
saw that.
footage.
Yes, ma'am.
Uh-huh. And table 17 for the finance new facility needs.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. If we looked at the scenario number 2, which is I think you said 550? Is it
Yes,
what
sir.
you used? 550, and they do not annex into the city. I understand our obligation to have firemen because they're in the fire district.
Right.
I do not understand, and maybe the fire chief is the right person to ask on this question, I do not understand why we would be paying for EMS for that area, because our EMS is for the city, and the county has EMS for the county. Am I missing that? It does? Okay. If we were to not have it annexed into the city, why would we need any more policemen? They would have to wait for the deputy to come from Bolivia to show up at their area to do police work. So why would we add 3 more policemen?
The scenario 2 only includes additional fire and EMS costs, no new police costs. I just mentioned that indirectly the police department would be affected because activity in the ETJ brings more traffic into the city, so that the city would have some indirect cost associated with that scenario 2, but it wasn't built into the model.
Okay, so to make sure I'm clear on that, so for scenario 2, they don't annex into the city because it's only 550, and so our police costs would not increase because unless it was a mutual aid,
Correct.
a life-threatening event, absent those, all the routine stuff that would take place, which is the majority of their work, we would not respond to. They'd have to wait for the deputy to come.
That's correct.
Okay.
Any other alderman with questions? Mr. Allen's not here. I'm sure he would have had some, and Mr. Carroll could be here tonight, but they both have excused absences, so they're okay.
Am I correct that we're going to circle back again? Thank you.
Okay, you're good with that? All right. Madam Chairman.
Are there members of the planning board that would have questions for either group? Go, Mr. Fisk.
Regarding the infrastructure impact, why is the electrical not included?
That was left out of our scope on purpose. That's just not an area of expertise that we feel comfortable making those kind of determinations on. And generally speaking, the electric infrastructure is highly regulated, and generally speaking, very self-sustaining. So we left that out of our scope of work.
It just seems like a really important number.
It certainly can be. Again, that's not our area of expertise, so we did not address electric.
Okay, I have a question for the fiscal. So in your study, there's staff expansion from A to Z. Are we not going to need more aldermen?
I don't think so. I don't think there's a provision to increase the number of aldermen.
It's just an interesting question because it's almost doubling the population built out to the maximum. So there's probably more discussion to come there. So my understanding is for the city agreeing to do this project, the benefit to us is $1.4 million per year.
Correct. Under the assumptions and analysis, that's correct.
Okay. How does that compare to the city budget now? You mentioned a number of 1.8 million. Is that what we're comparing the 1.4 to the general fund?
There isn't a comparable number to compare it to the city. You could compare projected revenues to the projected city total revenues and the same on the expenditures. You know, the city's budget right now is set to break even like all governmental budgets are. So, you know, what we would, our analysis, I think, demonstrates that the city has significant fixed costs associated to serve a population of 4,000, and because of the location of this particular project, that there are going to be excess revenues that could help subsidize the fixed costs that the county's already incurring to serve the population. As the Withers and Ravenel consultants opined, that could be a very different answer if this project was located somewhere else in the ETJ or, you know, somewhere else in another municipality. There's just some unique attributes about this project that are generating the fiscal benefits.
So the reason I ask that question is, so for me to understand, I'm not an accounting background, to add 1.4 million to, I'm presuming, our general fund, so that would, in essence, almost double our budget. I'm keeping it simple, but
Yeah, let's see if I have a number handy for you. Your general fund budget is $11 million. $11 million is your general fund expenditure budget.
so I guess what I'm coming to is Southport, if we look at it for sale, it's 1.4 million a year. That's the benefit.
I look at it from more of a cost accounting background. And I think it may be a better way to look at it is you have, the city has certain costs that vary with growth and certain costs that you'll have regardless if Indigo happens. I think you just mentioned you need a new police station. You need a new police station regardless if Indigo comes. You have fire stations that are already existing to serve the additional population. You don't need another fire station to serve this population. So this project is spinning off, just if you look at it in and of itself, extra dollars that will subsidize the fixed costs that the city's incurring. So if you look at it another way, it's an opportunity that you're able to grow the tax base, but you're going to have the benefit of having some of the costs that you're going to continue to have subsidized. Are you going to have new costs? Yes. because we know definitely for police and fire, there are going to be new costs. We know that you're undergoing a Parks and Recreation master plan, development of a master plan now, so you may be making decisions about increasing levels of service for your Parks and Rec department. So, potentially those dollars will be spent somewhere. So, and, I don't want to go so far as to say it would relieve the burden for existing taxpayers of the fixed costs, but if you think of where those costs really would be directed, it would be primarily probably towards the fixed cost of the city.
You have a number of, I think it's $800,000 for sales tax generated.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that's from like the 1,500 homes full of people spending money in the city. Is that what that's speaking of?
That's a great question. Sales tax is levied by counties and then distributed in Brunswick County based on a per capita basis. So that would be assuming that you all continue to receive sales tax distributions at the same levels that you are now, which another way of saying it is that we're assuming that people are going to new residents will be spending money similarly to existing residents, so that those amounts would be similar.
So did you have an amount for the 500 homes spending money in the town also?
The 550 homes under scenario 2 would not be annexed. So truly the only way that those homes affect the city's budget would be the collection of fire fees.
So
they don't generate
they're
any
still
other
going to live
revenues.
there and come to the city and spend money, but you don't have a dollar amount for their sales tax. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly, because if they're not residents of the city, then from the distribution that's based on population, you don't get to count those residents in the ETJ.
I think all our
So
businesses are happy that a lot of their income comes from non-residents and not just the residents of the city. So I think that's a dollar amount we've missed, because those people are going to spend their money in the city. I know, I would say it's a third of what that is. But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect observation, but that's just not the way sales tax flows through the governmental units in North Carolina. They actually are, again, levied by the county, and then the county distributes all of the collections to the municipalities based on population.
Yeah, I understand that. My point is, when that money goes to a business, it gets distributed whether the person lived in the city or the person lived in the ETJ. Is that not correct?
Well, the business collects the sales tax regardless of where someone
That's right.
lives, but it affects the budget of the local government based on population.
Okay. One other question. We're talking about the Parks and Rec. Now, at first, it wasn't one of the things that would be affected on your list, but then you had an amount that you had for them. Did you come up with how many new personnel they would need or any stuff like that? Is that how you came up with the dollar amount?
Basically, what we did is we looked at the personnel and operating cost on a per resident basis today and applied that same factor to the projected population of Indigo, and I think that turned out to be about $300,000 a year, that if we wanted to assume kind of the same levels of wear and tear on an annual basis as represented in the fiscal year 23 budget. And so that's how we determined the Parks and Rec. There aren't any Parks and Recreation facilities in Indigo right now that are planned to be dedicated to the city, that the city then would have ongoing maintenance. Roads is one we talked about. Roads would be dedicated and the city would assume responsibility for maintenance. We don't have that situation right now for Parks and Rec, and we didn't have sufficient information about where the city was moving in terms of potential future parks and recreation improvements to build that into the analysis. But so that's why we had to look at a more simple technique to try to estimate impact of Parks and Rec.
I think my question goes back to the Withers and Revenel folks. How many of these reports do you put together a year?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
How many of these reports do you put together a year?
How many of these reports do we produce a year?
I mean, we complete rate studies for water and sewer. We do this type of development analysis for our private clients as well as local government clients. If I had to put a number to it, it would have to be pushing at least 100 a year, somewhere in that range, I would think.
And I guess this is a bit of a follow-up question to Fred here. And the 100 or so that you put together, has the power infrastructure been part of any of those reports?
No. We do not do electric. Again, that's sort of a specialty infrastructure class. And again, this is not an area that we practice in.
So the two factors that sort of feed this report, one is the length of time this development's going to take to fully grow, and the second being the values of what's going to be put there. Both of which are driven by the developer. I guess I wonder how, you all do this for a living, I get that, and I respect that. I wonder at what point, if you did these reports after a project finishes 10 or 15 years down the line, do you have reports there to go back and reflect on, well, how accurate were we?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know that I've ever gone back specifically on any individual one and said, okay, did we miss it by 2% or 5%? Again, one of the things that we typically do, and I think we talked about that in like the second graph slide, where we talked about the sensitivity analysis. And that's really where we kind of come in and look in that area of really what is the potential risk back to the community if this development were to move forward? So to your point, let's say the developer moves forward, you're going to make them build all the streets, you're going to do all those things, and then the houses are going to go up. Recession hits, no houses go up. There's streets staying out there for 4 or 5 years maybe. Those streets are, going to be maintained by somebody, or when they're turned back over to the city, who is going to basically get those streets back up to standard? Again, could that be back on the developer? If you haven't adopted those streets or taken those in or annexed the property in, then it would certainly be the developer's responsibility. If you have, then it might be the city's responsibility. Those kind of variabilities, those are things that are really kind of difficult to play out. That's the reason why we do that sensitivity analysis. Again, if that number were down at 15%, hey, if we're off by 15% on our assumptions, I would put this in a bit more of a potential risky type development. But with a 70% sensitivity, that gives you a lot of room for the unknown things to happen, and it still not create a negative financial situation for you. Again, if your expenditures are much higher, then those numbers that we talked about obviously will be lower. There is, I'm going to sound like a commercial, there is no guarantee on the financial outcomes of anything like this. But again, using best practices, again, I think it's really a great thing that you did, where we basically come at this from 2 different points of view, from 2 different firms, to really kind of dive into the finances on this, to really see if we ended up back in generally the same places, and we did. And again, that builds that kind of confidence in that modeling as well.
And I think that expenses exceed projections by 70% is an interesting slide, in that the year 10, the revenue surplus would be just $7,000.
Correct.
And I think going back to Karen's point too, is that this is, again, I'm not a numbers graph person, but instinctively, I want to graph this out to years 11 through 20 to see where those numbers end up. And here, if we're talking about expenses exceed projections, if the level of service needs to be increased, and then B, also, they overvalued what they think their property is going to be worth, it would just, I guess, be interesting to see what year 15 looks like and what year 20 looks like. And then going back to, I guess, to my second question is that it would be interesting to see what other cities, and maybe this isn't a question for you all, but how has this been done for someone else, and how have they felt? And they've gone through the annexation process. Did they feel like this was an accurate representation?
That I can answer. That the answer to that is yes. Again, we do this quite a bit, even on the private side, where we're working with a developer, developing the pro forma for that development. Ultimately, what would their costs be? What would the, you mentioned system development fees. What are all those kind of costs back? Basically looking at it from the developer side as well of, does this development provide a positive cash flow at the end of that development? We do that quite a bit on the other side as well. And that, again, that's sort of the approach we took here as well, is looking at what are those expenses back to the developer, what are the expenses back to the city, what are the revenues back to both parties. Again, does it financially make sense on both sides?
Stop it.
Hello. Let me begin by mentioning that you have earned my respect because you've done a lot of work and very minutious work. It's been carefully presented. And I must confess two things. One, my utter ignorance about what we're talking about today. And number two, when it's been my turn to be standing there, my legs would shake, so I had to hold on to the podium so I wouldn't fall off. But I am going to do the same thing I did not too long ago, which is, because I don't know a whole lot, I am going to suggest we take the big picture look. How do we look at this, not challenge it, the $200,000 for road maintenance, not challenge it, the number of inhabitants per dwelling, because those things we could spend a lot of time. And I don't want to do that because that's not my expertise. So let's look at again, the big picture. You have been put in a very, very difficult situation because you have been asked to compare two different things. Lady, would you mind standing over there because I cannot look at you. Sorry about that. My point is that you have been asked to compare 1,542 dwellings against 550, which is not, and to quote a word you used before, apples to apples. That's very difficult to compare because the scales are different. And the limits of your comparison completely change. So I think that's a key point that I'm trying to make. And I think that comes from a decision made before we have had a chance to talk. And if we go to apples, I imagine basically apples to apples will be comparing 550 units annexed to the city, 550 units left outside, which is perfectly a clear comparison. So if we do that clear comparison, the numbers turn out very different. Why is that? Because you have a heavy load of dwellings there versus a small amount of dwellings. We could nitpick this and say, well, our 20 houses are more expensive, so the cost per dwelling will be higher. I don't like our 20, but I'm not going to go there. I'm trying to make that issue of the balance between the comparison very clear. I think that's very important because I think you're right. I think in the short term, the city will benefit, and this is common sense, from an increased income. But as soon as the roads begin to age, as soon as we have an impact to the infrastructure that is there, that gain is going to be diminished to the point that it becomes the other way around. So basically, for what I understood from reading is that that curve changes, and then the number you use there, which is $1.4 million, if it were for that case, will change versus the cost of addressing that area. But there is another comparison that I think is fundamental, and I think my neighbor here began looking at it. And that comparison is between the proposed development, either in or out of the city, versus the current conditions. He pointed out that the $1.4 million sounds like a great number. Well, the reality is that when you compare that with an operating budget of, I think it was 10.8, it's not that much. But the impact to our town is huge. It's not something to be, it's not in proportion. If the impact of the $1.4 billion to our budget is like 15%, the impact of the development is 100%. So it's completely out of proportion. So that comparison is very important, not only in terms of general budget, but for me, in order to have a better sense of how these things play out, I love to see what would be the cost of building a new facility for the police, building a new electrical substation, upgrading the roads. All of those things that have not been mentioned here will play a significant impact on that. But there's something going back to the big picture that I think is fundamental. And that is that the reality of the 1,542 dwellings by now is clear to the people of Southport that it's a wish, it's a number to negotiate, it's an irreal amount. Why is that? Because it's basically against the physical condition of the site. It'll be very hard to put that amount of houses there. But even worse, it's very much against the regulations at code. The last time I spoke here, I talked about two things. One was the impact, which is one of the parameters that we have to use to measure whether it's convenient or not to approve of this. The other one is consistency. Basically, whether that new development aligns with the policy, with the vision, but better yet, to the existing rules. And I keep on pointing out at our requirements. So then my point between the 550 versus 1,542 becomes a moot point. Because if the 542 dwellings is impossible, because the regulation forces us to match the R20 number, the two numbers are equal. So then the differences, the advantages of the incorporation for the Indigo project at this size completely disappear. So I think this is, in my mind, the heart of the matter. And it's not 1,000,004. It's the big picture. At the end, is what makes sense. It's about accuracy and precision. It's about following the rules. And I love to hear your comments because I've spoken too long.
So, again, it's kind of where I started from. We looked at it from a financial analysis, the project, right? Not whether it's in harmony with the community, whether it fits your guidelines, whatever it may be. We looked at it from a financial analysis standpoint. The really good thing is, to your point earlier, and I totally agree with you here, we're predicting the future, which is extremely difficult to do, right? Again, we have to make assumptions. And again, we try to make reasonable assumptions in the financial model. And when we look at those assumptions, we start to pull different levers, right? Let's pull on, what if the tax value, the proposed tax value for that particular type of product, what if it was 20% less? What if it was 30% less? What if the cost to maintain that goes up by 30%? Again, that's where that sensitivity piece comes in. So the second thing that I would say, back on the scenario that Lucy ran, kind of today's existing land use, right? Kind of a less dense. There's no right or wrong answer here, in my opinion, but just some facts, I guess, that we generally look at. Let's say that you put however many, 500, pick a number. Again, this is the fun thing with assumptions. We can make assumptions and put them in the model. But if we put 500 homes out there, do we still have the same mileage of streets to serve those same homes? Because there's more road frontage for each one of those single-family dwellings versus the same amount of distance of road may cover a 2-story, 3-story condo that has the same number of dwelling units. So again, there's a lot of variables that go into those models. We can certainly go in and model all those kind of different scenarios. That's not what we were asked to do. We were said, take this one development. Yeah, that's, again, so, yeah. Yeah. No, thank you for doing that. I want to make sure I was hopefully answering a question or not just rambling on myself. So at the end of the day, that's the really good thing about the model, is those kind of things can be done. But what we try to do to address that is really that sensitivity piece. Again, what if our assumptions were totally wrong? You mentioned the electric system. What if we didn't look at that. What if our assumption that the electric system was 100% self-funded? Because again, that's a highly regulated industry. It's, the utility commission goes through and takes a look at those rates to make sure that basically electric utility is not getting itself into trouble. But let's say that there was a major investment that was going to be needed. Again, we've got that ability inside this model to be able to handle that because of the assumptions that we made. And again, because of that sensitivity on the 70%. I mean, Shannon, you want to speak to that a little bit more, or?
Yeah, and I was just going to add, typically we don't look at any of the enterprise funds when we do these type of impact analysis because they are self-sufficient funds. So, your water and sewer fund, if you have one, any type of broadband funds or electric funds are typically controlled with user fees on the revenue side. So tax rates and any of your property values are not affecting those in terms of your revenues and your expenses. And so we typically just don't look at enterprise funds when we do this type of development analysis because, again, this analysis is based on tax revenues.
When you do your 100 analysis a year, do you do apples to apples? Or like in this case, apples to oranges?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify this apples to oranges comparison because there would be other engagements where we would look at multiple development scenarios that would be different, maybe annexation scenarios. That wasn't our mission here. Our mission was to compare what happens if the ETJ gets built out under existing zoning, and that's 550 units, and the city is negatively affected by that scenario as demonstrated by the effect on the Southport Fire District. In the other scenario was the Indigo project under a development program as presented to the city. So that there's this third comparison out there. I I'm not sure at this point is really meaningful when those kind of aren't the options right now. So that's why the city staff instructed us to analyze the two scenarios that are in the report.
Thank you. When I started, I mentioned that I understand you were placed in a very difficult situation by the guidelines you received from this project. But I want to point out very clearly that you have done a great job under those guidelines. For us, maybe what was relevant is a more apples to apples comparison. And I am repeating myself, so thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone have any follow-up from, go ahead, Chris.
The 550 units, did the city give you that number? Okay.
It's just an estimate, yes.
So I think I would say I appreciated getting all of this presented for the public and for the two boards. I'd agree with G. I believe we need to look past the money. And I guess a plain-spoken way, smacking our collective lips over an increase in the tax base shouldn't be enough to push us over the edge in approving this, because bottom line, as we've looked at maps, the things that have been presented to us by the developer, we're still looking at another half-size city within our city being proposed. It's a lot. This is, obviously revenue for the city is attractive. We've all seen that over the last bit of time, how far behind we are in some things for the city, but it's not the be-all, end-all for our small town and taking care of what so many of us either grew up here with or came here knowing how special it is. So it's, I've appreciated getting it. It's always best to see things actually presented than just to read them. But it's an awful lot to take in still and consider, having gotten it in a very short period of time, and now for the planning board to finish up its work on recommendations for this very week. It's a lot to take in. But I do thank you. I appreciate getting the information.
So no further questions from planning board members? Okay. We'll return to the board. Mayor Pro Tem.
I just have one question. Is there any difference in any of your modeling that if it, instead of R20 in the ETJ, it was a PUD in the ETJ, would the numbers still apply as far as what it would cost the city?
That was not a consideration.
Oh, I know,
Yep,
I
yep,
know.
no, so
I'm
no.
asking, no, I'm just asking, it would seem to me if it was the same 550 unit PUD versus a 550 R20, that your numbers would be the same.
I see what you're, because fire fees are assessed based on the square footage of the residential unit, it's going to be a
for the
mathematical.
cost of,
exactly,
right.
Exactly, yeah.
But that would be really the only differences would be just the actual project, the property values.
Well,
no, it
property-
doesn't even affect
right, the
us.
unit-
That's what I'm saying.
The unit count and the square footages would be how the fees were calculated.
Mr. Lombardi, any further questions?
Pretty sure I know the answer to this, but you say if you get 550, you won't annex to the city. But if you get 1,542, you will. Isn't it to the benefit of the people who are living there or will live there to be in a city that's well-oiled? Or is this, why is that? Why are you saying you won't annex? Well, I mean, it was a statement that you made that it would not be annexed with 550. Do you know why?
The two scenarios that we were provided by the city, under scenario 2, the assumption was it would not be financially feasible for a project of that low density to be annexed into the city from the private side.
Alderman Davis.
I don't have any questions because my questions arise from the unknowns and the assumptions that I simply don't know the answers to enough to then form some questions. I particularly appreciate the questions from the Planning Board. I think you drill down into this very effectively. Thank you.
Alderman Alt.
Okay, we're 210 days into this saga, more than 210 days. And actually, Chairman Hudgens and Ms. Mbelli, I agree with your line of thought. But since this is the only time we're going to have the consultants in front of me, I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions. You picked 1.53 people per residence as your number, correct?
The population
because the
factors-
developer told us in an open meeting it was 2.5. So I'm just trying to figure out how we got a 60% change.
Yeah, if you look on Appendix Table 2, if you have your report in front of you, for a fiscal impact analysis, we do this all over the country. Impact fee consultants use the same factors. American Community Survey, which is a survey instrument of the U.S. Census, you're able to determine persons per housing unit by housing product type. And I think, I'm not sure where a competing number came from, but other folks may use a persons per household, which does not consider any sort of vacancy factors, and would be definitely, potentially for Southport, more heavily weighted towards single-family residential when we have a whole mix of housing product types. So in the report, we use a kind of, I would think, a best practice technique that we make sure we're right-sizing the population with the product based on the most current census data available.
I'm not going to debate you because you've been doing this a long time. I'll only tell you that after I saw the 1.53, I went around to developers that I know and asked them did they thought that was a realistic number, and they did not. But you presented this number in your document. I just want to make sure everybody understands there's a potentially 60% difference, which instead of, it would double the size of the city in one development. That's the change, what that number means. So I just point that out. There's 15 of us sitting here that have some say in this whole thing. And it would be unrealistic that all 15 of us would be wooden soldiers marching down the road with all of the same opinion. So we're going to have different opinions on certain things. I'm going to say that our sewer system is never going to be taken over by the county in the next 10 years because it's so broken, they're not going to accept it until it's fixed. And so the impact fees are an important factor that need to be looked at. Yes, someday down the road, a board, maybe a different board, because I think it's going to be more than 2 years from now, will have to vote whether or not we do all of that. And we are looking at those things, But none of that is guaranteed, because by that time that decision is made, the same faces may not be sitting here. So we need to keep that in mind as well. The last thing is that I know if I polled this group out here, 90% of them are looking for one infrastructure thing that I was promised, because I mentioned it, that it should be in as a specific thing to look at if we're going to do an infrastructure study. It has nothing to do with you. You weren't asked to do it. But the entire community asked for to do it, and we just haven't done it yet. And that is a traffic impact analysis study on 9th Street at the elementary school. And that has not been done. 210 days into this program, and we couldn't even ask anybody to do that. Once again, not your fault. But I was assured that when I started talking about what the parameters for your project should be, that we specifically talk about what the things we wanted to have looked at, because that might mean who actually did the study and who would have the subject matter expertise to do that, or you might have to add somebody else to your staff, a subcontractor, to come in to do that. And we still haven't gotten that done. It's the same thing with the storyline about the intersections on Howe Street, with one lane on Robert Rourke to the left and one to the right. The only reason the North Carolina Department of Transportation put that in is that's the maximum they're allowed to do, because they cannot take eminent domain for a development. What they really meant, what they do say in convoluted words that the chairman brought up, is the fact that if they had their way, they would do something different, but they can't. It wasn't as clearly spoken. The only reason I know that for a fact is I sat across the table with the regional director of the North Carolina Department of Transportation and with 4 other people, and I asked that specific question, and that was the answer. So all of those impact studies that we have on Howe Street are based on the fact that there's a, whether we like this law or not, they can't take and expand the intersections outside of the existing right-of-way if it's exclusively for a development, and that was what they were looking at. And we should understand that those one lane here and one lane there isn't going to impact it. So we really should have had somebody come in here and look at it and say, based on 3,000 some odd people driving in and out, plus 70,000 square feet of commercial, more people being pulled in rather than just the residents, how does that impact the current 2 entrance exits and the roads that they lead on to? And in 210 days from that, into this program, we have not done that. So those are questions that are still hanging out there. But then you pull back to Mr. Bembelli's original argument to look at the big picture, and we have to decide. It's a thumbs up or thumbs down, as I understand it. And if I'm wrong, please let me know that. That eventually, you guys go first. Thumbs up, we agree that this is a good project for the Southport. Thumbs down, we don't agree. When it comes to us, we have thumbs up, thumbs down. After that, everybody goes back to stage 1. That's, I think, where we are. If I'm factually incorrect, then I'm willing to stand corrected on any of that. But I believe that's where we are. And with that, I thank you, because you had to put up with some of our banter back and forth that had to do with how we wrote you the statement of work, and you did your job. Thank you.
Now, is anyone from the audience, if you to please come up, just come up to the podium so everyone can hear you, and then tell us who you are and state your question. These are not comments, these are questions.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Kelly. I reside at 5971 Dutchman Creek Road in Indigo Phase 1. I grew up at 6014 Dutchman Creek Road, also in Indigo Phase 1. Few questions. Did the scenarios include the additional cost of the additional staff, including COLA and merit increases?
Yes.
Okay. The $200,000 to maintain the pavement, is that just the pavement in the development, or is that also our city streets with the additional traffic?
That is just to maintain the new infrastructure that would be adopted by the city.
Okay. You said that the ad valorem taxes didn't have a big effect on the development when you were speaking. The graphs showed otherwise. Is that?
To clarify, ad valorem taxes don't apply to scenario 2 because it's in the ETJ, so there would be no city property taxes. It's the primary revenue generator for the city, so that it's the largest line item for scenario 1.
And this might be a Thomas question. Do we have a percentage of the development that would actually be included in the current city? And have we looked at those numbers and what those ad valorem taxes will do and that tax base?
You're saying if the other part of it is kept in the ETJ?
Correct.
I want to say it's 20%, but it was not considered in this study.
Okay. So that, again, that's not on you guys. It's just something for all of us to consider is 20% of this development will still be in the city of Southport, and that wasn't one of the options that we were looking at here. With the graphs, we figured out that at year 8 is sort of the high point, and then it kind of starts to bell curve, as you guys mentioned. Does the trajectory continue on that downward trajectory, or how do we know that it plateaus if we haven't seen those numbers?
So we only looked at a 10-year fiscal impact for this project. Once you go beyond year 10, you're making some really granular assumptions that you just really don't know.
And then, do we have graphs for scenario 2? I only saw the graphs for scenario 1 in the presentation.
Scenario 2, the property tax value is reduced 25%.
I'm sorry, that must have been the
Yeah,
opposite.
she's speaking.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's speaking of her scenario 2.
Yeah.
No, I think Withers and Ravenel, I think, only looked at scenario 1. I don't think they did any work on what we call scenario 2. Okay.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, hi, David Rhodes, 404 Burrington. So this is a massive project, but I think sometimes something huge boils down to a couple simple things. And I think they've been spoken about tonight. One is the impact on the town, the quality of life. Does this fit here? And I think, I would tend to think all of us, or most of us, think that, you know, in no way does 1,500 homes dropped in, even if it's over 8 years, going to fit into this town. And the second part was this study, the financial impact. You figured, okay, well, maybe it doesn't fit in, maybe there's going to be a lot less quality of life, but maybe there's a pot of gold. What worries me, and I'm sitting in the back, and I love math. I've always loved math. I am not a mathematician. A friend of mine is. But math, numbers are specific. You know, when I hear words, and I understand Wall Street makes, you know, projections every year, but when I hear words like assumptions and all this, a bit nervous. And then, since the start of this, when I saw the presentation and I saw the diagrams and I spoke to a couple of friends that have been on the planning board, and, you know, I said to them, could 1,500 homes actually fit there? And I don't know, and this isn't a knock on you guys, I think you've taken on a tremendous task, and I appreciate it, as I'm sure the whole town does. But it seems like these numbers have kind of been like loosely, let's make a deal. Like I just heard, the 550 is an estimate. The 1,500 is probably an estimate. So I don't understand how, if there's two parts, quality of life, and for me it's two parts, quality of life and this, how we're making a assumption on an assumption that maybe if the 1,500 homes do fit, we might make 1.4 a year. So to me, and maybe it's just the way I think, did anyone ever sit down and look at the piece of land and see how many homes could fit on here? Because to me, and I know I'm saying it after the fact, but this is what tonight is here, is we're making an assumption on an assumption, whereas someone could have figured out what the numbers should have been. Should they have been 1,500? You know, from what I hear, there's no way in heck that 1,500 homes could fit in there. And under present zoning, you couldn't fit 550 there. So, you know, I'm having a hard time understanding, besides quality of life, and I appreciate Chairwoman what you said, and also Mr. Gimbelli, but I don't understand how we draw any, and it's not a knock on you guys. Sure. You guys were given certain, you know, statements, and you were asked to create a piece of research on that, and you did it. It's super. I mean, it lays it out, but it was based on an assumption. So the 1.4 may sound good, but it's just merely an assumption. And to me, and I'm not a betting guy, I don't think you could fit 1,500 homes. And it's not like, oh, well, if we could fit 12, that's whatever it is, 75%, so we'll get 75% of the 1.4. It doesn't work that way. As I think someone questioned, or someone here questioned, as far as, you know, fractions. That numbers change drastically. So I guess I'll wait for the final verdict, but this, I mean, it's good work of art, good work once again, but it's based on an assumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Anyone else? Please.
Hi, Shirley Sullivan, 5002 Seaward Court in Rivermist, which is in Southport. My questions. When will these the printed studies be shared with the public? When will the planning board be making their recommendation? Will it be this Thursday? Because I'm aware that the time limit is up. I'm glad we got to speak tonight, but it's not enough time just looking at this. Why? My big question, when I keep hearing this 550 in scenario 2 from the ETJ, if it's not annexed, isn't there still some revenue from the inside of Southport that doesn't have to be annexed from R20? Why isn't that being shared? There's revenue there. You know, you're still developing. And let's see, why would the infrastructure study use a 1% revenue growth over, you know, each year over 10 years? I have too many questions. When is the town hall meeting going to be?
We'll have to set that, you know, to make sure all the aldermen, you know, can be there. But it'll be before the, it'll be after the planning board meeting. And if the pilot prints my update, it will be in there, the explanation. But it'll be after the planning board meeting on the 21st and before the August 11th Board of Alderman meeting. And if we want to make it as soon as possible after the planning board meeting, because if we need a second one, and if we need to invite back the developer or the consultants or whatever will be able to do so. And then there will be a public hearing at the Board of Alderman meeting, so there will be comments, questions by the public there also.
Okay.
So there'll be 3 more opportunities.
Yeah, but when will we get the printed study that developed these comments?
This should already be online.
On the City of Southport website?
The fiscal impact
be.
analysis, the PowerPoint was posted, and I'll be posting the full report tomorrow, if it's not already done. The final report from Withers Ravenel has not been completed, as far as I know.
Okay. How long has the board and the planning board had to review these studies?
From what I understand, they received one of them Friday. Is that correct? Yeah.
The fiscal impact analysis
week
was
ago.
sent to the boards, not this past Friday, but the Friday prior. And the Withers Ravenel PowerPoint, which is all that anybody has access to, was delivered this past Friday.
Okay. What were they dated?
All right off, I can find out.
Okay.
We sent it as soon as staff had a chance to review it with the consultants. It was sent to the boards.
Okay. I guess my question is, the public may be only given 2 days to prepare their comments for the planning board meeting. Is that enough time?
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It's Thursday night.
Okay.
I know that's not a lot of time. That's not ideal, but
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
To add to that also, typically the boards do receive their packets at least the Friday before the meeting and made available to the Monday before the meeting. So.
Who would like to come up and ask questions next from the public? Thank you. Welcome.
Good evening, Tom Hale. I live at 426 Lord Charles Drive. The discussion was the point that was discussed, and it was not part of their expertise, is the electrical grid. My questions, I don't know who the questions go to, whether it be the planning board, to Thomas Lloyd, to the aldermen. What is the scope of the electrical grid infrastructure build-out for either scenario? Second question, who will pay for it? Third question, how do these numbers affect the studies presented this evening? And fourth question, who's going to speak to the addition of these electrical grid numbers, to the planning board and to the Board of Aldermen and to the citizens of Southport? Thank you.
Okay, we have an electrical grid question, so I don't know who wants to take that. City manager?
We've been in discussion with our development attorney or our development agreement attorney and a electrical expert here in the state of North Carolina. And at this particular point in time, it is our feeling that the developer will have to indeed help pay for an electrical substation to provide electricity to this development. What that amount will be dependent on what density you approve.
Any other questions from the public? Yes, ma'am, please.
I'm Joanne Weaver. I'm a resident of Southport in Smithville Woods. And my question is, did the study that I believe it was that 6 additional policemen were needed for scenario 1? Is that correct? 6 additional. Will those 6 additional policemen be directing traffic at Robert Rourke? I'm not trying to be funny because I live on Robert Rourke. It's the only exit out of my development. It's the only way out. And today, it takes 2 cycles of traffic lights to get through. And that's today. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? Yes, please, Mr. Lightbourne.
My name's Jim Lightbourne. We live at 316 West Street. So when I've looked at annexation studies that I found online, they seem to consider more things than you do in your reports. And we were under the impression this was going to be an annexation study. So would you consider what you did an annexation study?
No, we would consider this a financial analysis of a specific development, is what we were tasked to do here. Again, to your point, so maybe this is a good thing to kind of share, because we've kind of went around the edges of this a little bit. And lots of times these projects are completed in a phased analysis, right? So it's sort of like doing a diagnosis. If we go through this initial financial analysis and all these were red, we can probably stop talking about this development today. If they're green, then we can talk about harmony with the existing conditions. We can talk about TIAs, right? Traffic analysis, right? We can talk about what are those impacts. We can dive into the electric grid. How much of an investment would that developer need? But this is where you start, because if these numbers don't work, then there's no reason to have any further discussion. And I'm going to commend your staff, your board, your planning department, and your planning board. We have communities that do not do this and find themselves way upside down with their rates, with their taxes, with the investments that they've incurred. There's a recent city that I worked with adopted a new land use plan. When they adopted that land use plan, they adopted a $13.5 million sanitary sewer investment requirement, is what that land use plan actually created. So again, to your point earlier, when we look at these types of studies, that's really what we're trying to see. Are our fees in alignment? Are our revenue streams in alignment to make that development self-sustaining? Then from there, the questions of harmony or traffic analysis, is it the right fit for this community? Is this the right vision for this community? That's not what we're here to speak about at all. Now, I've stood on this podium with other developers to speak on those things, but I'm not a representative of this developer. I'm a representative doing the financial analysis for the city, and that's basically what we prepared. And again, to that last piece on that, to really kind of drive this home, on that 70% sensitivity, we can go, as I think you said this beautifully, right? Wooden soldiers marching in a line. I can make my assumption about how many people are going to live 1.53, right? What if it's 2? That's an assumption. What if the revenue, again, is off by 20%? What if the expenditures are off by 20%? What if the electric grid is further out of whack? Those are all fair assumptions. Again, we do the best we can with the data we have available. But what we try to show in that sensitivity piece is how much room for error do we have in these assumptions? And again, at a 70% assumption for error, that's a pretty wide window to work in. So financially, makes sense. Whether you move forward with the development or not, have no particular interest to me. Is it the right fit for this community? I don't know. I don't live in this community. But financially, it at least is sustainable for this community. And that is a great thing that you went through that exercise, because many, many places do not. thank you for your question too as well. Yeah, very good.
I guess again, in reading annexation studies, they look at other financial impacts on a city besides these factors you've looked at. For example, it's been mentioned that with this increase in population, it's going to have an impact on those people using the roads in our city, as well as the services. So annexation studies seem to be more comprehensive than what I've seen here, even on the financial aspects. So I agree, you have a financial impact study, but from what I understand, it's not really an annexation study to look at even the whole financial picture. And again, I assume you did what you were asked to do. But it doesn't seem consistent with the annex studies that I've seen.
Yes, sir. Please come on up.
Good evening. Bill Matskovich, 4417 Willamoss over in Forest Oaks. And I appreciate the work that you folks have done. I'm sure you've stuck to your scope of work and responded to what you were asked to do. Sure. But this is a lot bigger than this, okay? My big question is, we've got a decision coming up soon, and we are missing a ton of investigation. I want to know, because I live off of Robert Ruark, and I also know where 9th Street is in the school. Where are we with the DOT that's going to make recommendations as to what we can or can't do? Would you say 210 days into this thing? We know nothing. We do know that eminent domain cannot claim the corners. I want to know from the Board of Aldermen, Planning Board, anybody, what's going to happen when this traffic already is backing up and the quality of life in this town is going to go down the tubes. So who can answer that? Where's DOT? Mr. Mayor?
The DOT, they'll be speaking Thursday morning at the Chamber of Commerce, and the tickets are $10. And I'm not being silly, he's actually going to be here, Chad Kimes, the engineer. Secondly, Mr. Lloyd, from what I recall, a traffic impact study was done, a TIA study was done. Did it include 9th Street and Robert Ruark?
Yes, I mean, 9th Street and Robert Ruark are NCDOT roads, so it was required to include both of those because that is a NCDOT road.
And from what I remember, there were some mitigation measures on Robert Ruark in terms of expanding lanes and expanding the road and that type of thing. Not that it's ideal by any means, but was that addressed from what I remember in that study, and that the intersection would be modified and that type of thing should this development come through? And also the fact that Osprey Landing is also coming off of Robert Ruark.
Well, yes, and the 211 widening is already happening, but I think what they were mentioning earlier is that they couldn't add an additional lane where GoGas is because they can't do eminent domain for a development for that property. So I think that's what they were getting at. And NCDOT's letter even mentioned that ideally there would be an additional lane there for that, but what they recommended was to take other actions to further distribute that trip traffic. So I mean, an example could be, having an additional access point on 11th Street, for example. But they did recommend further actions to better distribute all of that traffic. But I think what they were mentioning earlier is that the additional turn lane on Robert Ruark is not possible because of the right-of-way constraints there.
That is correct. I've got 200 homes going in behind where I live in a new development off of Ruark. We got 1,550 homes planned for this. You know what, folks? Put on the brakes, go back to the drawing board, and figure it out. Because right now, this train is moving down the tracks, and we don't have answers. And I'd like to see some answers, please.
To follow up on your statement, sir, is that the study on 9th Street, Street is 9th Street and how? Okay?
Right.
It's not the school. It's not traffic coming off of Indigo Plantation Road, which is the other way. Apparently, children will not be allowed in this development because nobody has freaking factored them in, which is different. We were headed towards being the greatest city probably in North Carolina. We may be, but COVID has changed that, and there's a lot of families starting to move in now, and we have not taken that into consideration. And they will be coming to that elementary school and be coming in the opposite direction that most of the people are coming from now, and they will block both lanes of 9th Street. That means if you have a heart attack at the school, they're going to be running with their kits over the cars to get to you because nothing has been fixed here. We have no impact study to do that. Any other catastrophe that you can think of at the school in this day and age, you're going to be backed up with cars from here to Cucamonga, and we will not be able to do anything on this because 210 days into it, everybody's turned a blind eye to that. And we need somebody who actually understands how to do it and that is neutral and will do those studies.
Well, thank you all for your service. Thank you for the time today. And I think just got to put the brakes on and really focus on getting everything out on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next? Anyone else from the public? Any citizens? Anyone that would like to? Mr. Fisk for the question.
I don't know if this is appropriate, but the comment that you just made, Gordon, about the electrical infrastructure, does that mean that the city is legally obligated to supply part of that infrastructure to Indigo Phase 2?
Yes. It really, it comes down to what density this project ends up being will be the, what portion that the developer has to pay and what portion that the city has to pay. But we're not going to be stuck holding the bag for the entire price of it. From our understanding, from our attorneys, it will be a partnership between the developer and the city to provide electricity to this development. It will be contingent on what density is eventually approved, whether it's 1,500 units or 550, 500. That's what it will boil down to. Obviously, if it's the higher density that it is, the more participation the city is going to require from the applicant to help with that cost. Does that make sense?
Can I ask you a question? Okay. Would we be obligated to supply all of the electrical infrastructure and service if the developer opted not to annex that? I believe it's, 60% that's not in the city limits?
Alderman Davis, I can't answer that question, but that's a very good question. I can't answer that from a legal perspective.
Sullivan. We're here until everyone has asked their questions, and no apology.
I'm not sure I heard correctly, but I guess the fiscal study did not address capital improvements such as the electrical substation? The cost of? Didn't include that?
None of our studies dealt with the electrical component, correct?
So the cost of that is not in here?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. We did include road maintenance.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And the fiscal study was flat at today's prices, costs, whatever, for 10 years. The 1.4 per year is based on a 0.3956 property tax rate. Everything is the same, nothing increased, right?
So we,
The build-out is like today's prices.
so the assumptions on the expense is annually adjusted for 4% growth.
That was the Williams-Ravenel.
That's correct.
Yeah.
The DPFG and assumed
So it's,
today's rates.
it's common in fiscal analysis
Okay.
that you prepare and build out in constant
Okay,
dollars.
I didn't know.
So that's our, right,
Okay.
that's what I'm saying, that's our approach.
Now I understand.
And they looked at it through different lenses.
took
So
a
we
different-
worked
Okay,
with
I got it. Okay. There's so much. Okay.
Great question.
And the traffic impact analysis, there was one done, but again, my question is the growth rate was accordingly, appropriately used. The North Carolina Department of Transportation's annual 2% growth, but Southport's is 4% now. It's growing. So the real net daily trips would be 20,000 a day. Is that correct? It was 11,000 per the traffic impact study, so it would be like 22,000 plus. Does that make sense? If you applied City of Southport's growth rate. Okay, that's it. I'm done.
Okay, is there anyone else that would like to speak? Questions? Mr. Perry, Mr. Paul, would y'all like to make any comments?
Chad Paul, CEO of Baldwin Island Limited. For the emotional piece, 1986, summer of 1986, I dug the footers for the entrance of Indigo Plantation Phase 1. My father's name is on every single deed in Indigo Plantation 1. I believe, Mr. Mayor, Baldwin Island Limited is the single largest taxpayer in the town, private taxpayer, and has been that way for 30-something years. When Indigo Phase 1 was done, that was the largest residential development done in the community at that time. The largest commercial development done in the community is Deep Point and the facilities there for the marina. Couple things. Ms. Carroll, it's about 15-16% that's in the city, about 84-85% in the county. 20% is too high. It's a little less than that number in terms of what's in the city and what's not. I would also suggest, can 1,542 homes fit? Yes, it can. I would suggest that this group, several years ago, with Mr. Heisen and Mr. Cherico, pretty much approved a 2,200 unit development down there. And they didn't put the pipe to Southport. They built a package plant on site. So we can talk about ecological changes and changes in technology to allow us what we need to do back then, which was what, 14, 15 years ago. They were going to have their own sewage package plant out there because of the infrastructure problems we have. When we first looked at this, we looked at their development, we looked at what they brought to you all. We looked at 2,100 units. We said, hey, you know what, in terms of the model, the mix, that's not going to work for us. So that's how we got to 1,542. In terms of the water and sewer, the sewer lift station is just south of Walmart, the intersection of Jabbertown is not where the Sandy Hook lift station is. So we will be running pipe up to the Sandy Hook station, which is near Walmart, not near Jabbertown. Notwithstanding Jabbertown, we do own that 3.5 acres. That is a relief point for DOT in terms of what they're trying to do with that entire intersection. In addition, we also own the northwest corner of 9th and House Street. So in terms of turning lane there, et cetera, we have the ability to help alleviate some of that in terms of DOT. Sitting back and looking at it all, a couple of things. There's harmony, there's emotion, and then there's really what these two bodies can do legally. So much of the stuff that we want to do, they have a judicial bounds that they've got to work in terms of the infrastructure relative to electricity. Mr. Hargrove is 100% correct. If we annex in, we need to pay our fair share of that substation. If we don't annex in, we don't pay anything. Brunswick Electric just has to show up in the county and hook us up. There is an opportunity here to work where I think that, notwithstanding the harmony issues we need to discuss, notwithstanding some of the other judicial issues we need to discuss, financially, we're paying more than our fair share. And that's never been an issue for us. We need to provide additional dollars for the existing base of what we've got to work with from an infrastructure standpoint in Southport. On the harmony piece, that's what we're here to talk about. That's what we're here to deal with. But in terms of can the development handle it, this group walked Mr. Heisen and Mr. Cherico through at 2,000 plus units, and they built their own package plant instead of us piping it up to Sandy Hook Station. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Paul? Anyone in particular? Okay. All right. Mr. Perry, would you, any comment from you, sir? Okay. All right. Thank you. Any further questions from anyone? Okay. Good. The board's good. Both boards are good. Madam Chairman for the Planning Board, I'll let you sum up if you would like, or any of your members would like to sum up before we leave.
Unless anyone has any other questions or comments they'd like to make, I think we're done, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. From the Board of Aldermen, Mayor Pro Tem, any comments? Mr. Lombardi, Alderman Davis, Alderman Alt?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. I've enjoyed this process because our city is precious to everyone in here, and everyone in here loves the city of Southport, and we want to do what's best for our city. And this is a pivotal time in our city and in the history of this city. So I appreciate everyone being here. I appreciate the consultants and the work that you've done. I enjoyed reading both of those and seeing it and hearing the presentation. It helps tremendously. It's like like in medical school, if you missed a lecture and if you just read it, you didn't get the full impact of that presentation. So thank you for that. City staff, thank you for being here. And Thomas Lloyd, thank you. I know this has been big in the planning board. You're the ones that are doing most of the lifting, absolutely, in that regard. The many meetings that you've held, what you've learned, and the knowledge that you have given to not only to the citizens with all these different meetings, but also the information that you'll be giving to the Board of Aldermen so they can make the best decision possible. Mr. Paul and Mr. Perry, thank you for being here. Our citizens, thank you all for being here. And again, we will have one, and if necessary, 2 town hall meetings, and then there will be a public hearing at the Board of Alderman meeting on August 11th, where you can ask questions, make comments, and as I say, we'll be here until all questions are asked. And you know you can contact any alderman or City Hall, the city manager, with your questions, and we can continue this dialogue. It just doesn't have to stop here. So thank you to the press for being here. Thank you, the chiefs, for being here, and again, all city staff. And I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Lombardi, and a second by Mayor Pro Tem. Madam Chairman, rather, excuse me.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Do I see a motion for us to adjourn? And a second. All in favor?
All in favor?
Any opposed?
Aye.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you.